Hey folks, I know I am just an old guy telling stories, but please leave a like and subscribe before we start. Let's enjoy in today's stories. It all started about a year ago when I made a mistake that I'm still paying for. I'm not a reckless person by nature, but desperation has a way of clouding your judgment. I was in a tough spot financially, like really tough. The kind of situation where every single day is a balancing act between bills, rent, and just trying to survive. My job at the time wasn't cutting it, and despite countless applications and interviews, nothing else was panning out. I had maxed out my credit cards, borrowed from friends, and even sold off some personal stuff to stay afloat. But it wasn't enough. Then, in a moment of sheer panic, I did something incredibly stupid. I had heard about the dark web, mostly from urban legends and horror stories, but I never thought I'd find myself actually digging through it. I wasn't looking for anything illegal, just some way, any way, to get some quick cash. That's when I stumbled upon a forum that seemed different. It wasn't flashy, no creepy images or cryptic messages, just a plain old thread with a title that read, "Need money? No credit check, no collateral, instant approval." I knew it was shady, of course I knew, but I was desperate. I clicked on the thread and scrolled through the comments. People were talking about how they'd received thousands of dollars within minutes, no questions asked. It sounded too good to be true, but desperation has a way of making you ignore the obvious red flags. At the bottom of the thread, there was a contact link. I hesitated for a long time before clicking it, but in the end, I did. It led me to a simple form where I had to fill in my name, email, and the amount I wanted to borrow. I typed in $5,000, a ridiculous sum, but one that would clear my immediate debts and give me some breathing room. After submitting the form, I sat there staring at the screen, half expecting nothing to happen. But within minutes, my phone pinged with a notification. I checked my bank account, and there it was, $5,000, just like that. No approval process, no confirmation email, just the money sitting in my account. For a few days, I was on cloud nine. I paid off my debts, caught up on my bills, and even treated myself to a few things I hadn't been able to afford in a long time. But that high was short-lived. About a week later, I received an email from a sender simply named Collector. The email was short and to the point. "Your repayment terms have begun. Details will follow." No signature, no contact information, just that one ominous line. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I hadn't really thought about the repayment terms when I borrowed the money. There hadn't been any fine print or contracts, just the instant cash. I figured there would be some interest or penalties if I was late, but nothing too extreme. 2 days later, I got another email. This time, it had an attachment, a PDF file titled Terms. I opened it and my heart sank. The document was several pages long, detailing the repayment schedule and penalties for missing payments. But the interest rate was the part that made my head spin, 100% compounded weekly. It was an astronomical figure, one that would turn my $5,000 debt into an insurmountable sum within a matter of months. Panicking, I tried to reply to the email, asking for more reasonable terms, but my message bounced back. There was no way to contact the collector directly, no way to renegotiate. I felt like I was drowning. The next few weeks were a blur of anxiety and dread. I made the first payment on time, but it barely made a dent in the balance. The second payment was even harder to scrape together. By the third, I was completely tapped out. And that's when the emails started getting more frequent, more urgent. Payment due in 24 hours. Failure to comply will result in further action. I didn't have the money. I couldn't make the payment. And that's when things started getting really weird. It started small, a knock at the door late at night with no one there when I checked. My mail began to go missing, or I'd find it scattered across the front lawn. One morning I woke up to find my car had been keyed. Deep, jagged scratches that spelled out a single word. Pay. I was being watched, that much was clear, but by who or what, I had no idea. The next email came with instructions. If I couldn't pay, I'd have to perform certain tasks to work off the debt. The tasks were strange but not dangerous at first. I was told to deliver a package to an address across town, no questions asked. Then I had to leave an envelope full of cash in a locker at the bus station. These were the kinds of things you'd expect in a crime thriller, not in real life. But I did them, because I had no choice. The emails were always watching, always waiting for me to slip up. As the weeks passed, the tasks grew more unsettling. I was told to break into an abandoned house and take photos of the inside. Another time I was instructed to follow a man around the city, taking notes on his movements. I had no idea what I was involved in, but I was in too deep to back out. The fear of what might happen if I refused was enough to keep me compliant. Then came the day I received a task that made my blood run cold. I was to pick up a package from a specific location and deliver it to an address I didn't recognize. The instructions were clear. Under no circumstances was I to open the package. The delivery was to be made at midnight and I was to leave it on the doorstep without knocking. This was the first time I truly feared for my life. What if the package contained something illegal? What if I was caught? I knew I was being watched, so there was no way I could refuse. I did as I was told. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sealing my fate. As I drove away from the drop-off point, I received a text message from an unknown number. "Good job, your debt is almost paid." That should have been a relief, but instead, it felt like a death sentence. Almost paid wasn't good enough. I needed out. The next day I tried to go to the police, but as soon as I mentioned the dark web and the money I had borrowed, they shut me down. They said there was nothing they could do, that I was lucky I hadn't been scammed out of my money entirely. I left the station feeling more alone than ever. I tried to ignore the emails after that, but the collector wasn't having it. The tasks became more frequent, more dangerous, and the threats more explicit. I was caught in a web of fear with no way out. I had borrowed $5,000 and it had cost me my peace of mind, my sense of security, and maybe soon, my life. But this is just the beginning. What happened next made me wish I'd never heard of the dark web, never borrowed that money, and never underestimated the lengths people will go to when they're owed a debt. After that last delivery, things went quiet for a while. I thought, maybe naively, that I was finally in the clear. The text message I had received had said my debt was almost paid, and I clung to that word almost like it was my lifeline. I was hoping that if I just kept my head down and did as I was told, this nightmare would eventually end. But as I should have expected by now, it wasn't going to be that simple. About a week after the midnight delivery, I received another email. This one was different from the others. There was no task, no threats, just a single line of text. "It's time we met in person." I can't begin to describe the sheer terror that ran through me when I read those words. I had been dreading this moment, fearing the day when this faceless collector would finally step out of the shadows. Up until now, they had been a ghost, someone I could pretend wasn't real if I tried hard enough. But meeting in person, that meant they were real, and worse, that they knew where to find me. The email included a time and place, a small cafe on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you only go if you're trying to avoid attention. I was supposed to be there at 10 p.m. and I was told to come alone. There was no mention of what would happen if I didn't show up, but by now I knew better than to ignore their demands. The day of the meeting, I was a wreck. I couldn't focus on anything at work, my mind racing with all the possible scenarios. Were they going to hurt me? Was this a trap? Or worse, was this just the beginning of something far more sinister? I considered not going, but I knew that would only make things worse. So, with a pit in my stomach and my nerves shot, I headed to the cafe that night. When I arrived, the place was almost empty. A couple of people sat at the counter, sipping coffee and minding their own business. I scanned the room, looking for someone who might be waiting for me, but no one stood out. I was about to take a seat when a man in a dark suit approached me. "You're here," he said, his voice calm and cold. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He was tall, with a lean build and sharp features. His eyes were hidden behind a pair of tinted glasses, which somehow made him even more intimidating. He gestured to a booth in the corner and I followed him over, sitting down across from him. "I've been watching you," he said, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "You've been doing well so far, but we have some unfinished business." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I thought my debt was almost paid. He smiled, a thin, humorless smile that sent a chill through me. "Almost, but not quite. You see, the money you borrowed came with certain expectations. You've met some of those expectations, but there's more work to be done." I didn't dare ask what kind of work he meant. I already knew it wasn't going to be anything good. "Here's how this is going to work," he continued. "You'll be given a final series of tasks. Complete them, and your debt will be considered repaid in full. Fail, and, well, I'm sure you understand the consequences." He slid a small envelope across the table to me. I hesitated before picking it up, my hands trembling as I did. Inside was a piece of paper with an address written on it. No instructions, no details, just an address. "You'll go there tonight," he said, leaning back in his seat as if the conversation was over. "You'll find everything you need when you arrive. I trust you'll make the right decisions." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. Without another word, he stood up and left the cafe, leaving me alone in the booth with the envelope clutched in my hand. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't just about money anymore. It felt like I was being dragged deeper into something much darker, something I didn't fully understand. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to leave the cafe and head to the address. It was in a part of town I wasn't familiar with, an old industrial area that had seen better days. The buildings were mostly abandoned, their windows broken, and their walls covered in graffiti. The streetlights were few and far between, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The address led me to a rundown warehouse at the end of a narrow alley. I could see a faint light coming from inside, and as I approached, I noticed that the large metal door was slightly ajar. Every instinct in my body was telling me to turn around and run, but I knew I couldn't. I had to see this through, no matter how much I wanted to escape. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warehouse was mostly empty, save for a few crates and broken-down machinery. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, and sitting on the chair was a small black duffel bag. My heart pounded as I approached it, my mind racing with all the possible horrors that could be inside. When I reached the chair, I hesitated for a moment before unzipping the bag. To my relief, it wasn't anything dangerous, at least not immediately. Inside the bag were several stacks of cash, neatly bound together with rubber bands. There was also a small burner phone with a single contact saved on it, labeled only as "Contact." I stared at the phone, dreading what I knew I had to do next. This wasn't just about delivering packages or taking pictures anymore. This was something much bigger, and I was right in the middle of it. But I had no choice. I had come too far to back out now. With shaking hands, I picked up the phone and dialed the number. It rang only once before a voice on the other end answered. "Good, you found the package. Now listen carefully." The voice was the same as the man from the cafe, calm, cold, and devoid of any emotion. He gave me instructions for my next task, one that made my stomach drop. I was to deliver the bag of cash to another address, but this time I wasn't to leave it at the door. I was to go inside, meet the person waiting for me, and hand it over directly. "You'll know him when you see him," the voice said before hanging up. I was left standing in that empty warehouse, clutching the phone and the duffel bag, trying to summon the courage to go through with it. I didn't want to meet this person. I didn't want to know what I was involved in, but I had no choice. I was trapped, and the only way out was to keep going forward. The new address was in an even rougher part of town, and by the time I got there, it was well past midnight. The building was an old, dilapidated apartment complex, the kind where the elevators haven't worked in years, and the stairwells smell like urine. I climbed the stairs to the third floor, the bag of cash feeling like a lead weight in my hands. When I reached the apartment, I hesitated before knocking on the door. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure whoever was inside could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, and I was met with a pair of cold, unblinking eyes. The man who opened the door was nothing like I expected. He was old, maybe in his late 60s, with thin white hair and a hunched posture. He looked frail, like he could barely stand, but there was something in his eyes that told me he was far more dangerous than he appeared. "You're late," he said, his voice raspy but firm. I didn't know what to say, so I just handed him the bag. He took it without a word, opened it, and began counting the money with surprising speed. When he was done, he nodded once and motioned for me to leave. "Tell them it's done," he said before closing the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, stunned by how anticlimactic the whole thing had been. I had expected something more, something terrifying or violent, but instead it was just this old man counting money in a dingy apartment. But as I walked back down the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There was something more going on, something that I was only just beginning to glimpse. When I got back to my car, I used the burner phone to call the number again. The same voice answered, and I told him what the old man had said. "Good. You're almost there," the voice replied. "But there's one more thing you need to do." I knew it. I knew this wasn't over yet. And as the voice on the other end of the line began to explain my final task, I realized just how deep I had gotten myself into this mess. This last task was different, more personal, more dangerous. It wasn't just about delivering money or packages anymore. This was something that could change everything, and that's when I knew there was no going back now. I spent the entire drive home trying to make sense of what had just happened. The old man in the apartment, the cold voice on the phone, the never-ending tasks. None of it made any sense. It was like I was living in some twisted version of reality where every move I made was being controlled by someone else. And now, with this final task looming over me, I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, with no idea how far the fall would be. When I got home, I barely slept. I kept thinking about that last phone call, the one where the voice told me about the final task. I hadn't gotten many details, just that it was something I needed to do quickly and discreetly. The voice didn't give me an address this time. Instead, it told me to wait for further instructions. I hated the waiting. It made the fear and anxiety even worse. The next morning, as I was trying to go about my day as normally as possible, the burner phone buzzed. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the text. "Tonight, 11 p.m., meet at the usual place." I didn't know what the usual place was. I had never met these people outside of that cafe, but I figured that's what they meant. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves. But I couldn't delay any longer. I grabbed the burner phone and headed out, my thoughts racing with every possible scenario. When I arrived at the cafe, the man in the dark suit was already there, sitting at the same booth in the corner. He didn't acknowledge me when I walked in, but I knew he was waiting for me. I slid into the booth across from him, my hands sweating as I waited for him to speak. "You're late," he said, his voice as emotionless as ever. "I'm sorry," I stammered, unsure of what else to say. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he slid another envelope across the table. This time it was thicker, almost bulging with whatever was inside. I hesitated before picking it up, but I knew better than to refuse. "Your final task," he said, leaning back in his seat. "Open it." I did as he asked, my fingers trembling as I tore open the envelope. Inside were several photographs, each one showing a different person. There was a middle-aged man in a suit, a young woman with a child, an elderly woman in a wheelchair. At first, I couldn't figure out what connected them, if anything. But then I saw it. Each photo had the same symbol drawn on it, a simple black circle with a line through it, like a crossed-out eye. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there in every single photo. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Your final task," he repeated, as if that explained everything. "These people owe us. You're going to collect what's due." I stared at him, not fully understanding. "Collect how?" He smiled, that same thin, humorless smile I had seen before. "You'll find out soon enough. Each of these people has something that belongs to us. You're going to retrieve it. The instructions for each one are in the envelope. Follow them exactly, and your debt will be cleared." I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just about money anymore. Whatever they wanted me to do, it involved these people, innocent people from the looks of it. I didn't want any part of it, but I knew I was in too deep. I couldn't back out now, not without risking everything. The man stood up, leaving me alone with the envelope and my thoughts. I waited a few minutes before opening it again, dreading what I would find. Inside were several sheets of paper, each one detailing a different person's life, where they lived, where they worked, their daily routines, and at the bottom of each page was a set of instructions, clear and concise. The first one was simple enough. Find the man in the suit, follow him to his office, and retrieve a specific item from his desk, a small, unmarked key. The instructions didn't say what the key was for, just that I had to get it and bring it back to the cafe by morning. If I succeeded, I would move on to the next task. If I failed, well, the consequences were clear. That night I followed the man as instructed. It felt wrong, watching him from a distance, knowing what I was about to do. But I couldn't stop myself. I was driven by a fear so deep it felt like it was controlling me. The man worked late, his office in a tall glass building downtown. I watched as he stayed at his desk, tapping away on his computer, completely unaware of my presence. When he finally left, I made my move. The building was mostly empty by then, and it wasn't hard to slip inside unnoticed. The instructions had been specific: 3rd floor, last office on the right. I found it easily, the door unlocked as if they had been expecting me. Inside, the desk was neat and tidy, with a single drawer left slightly open. I didn't have to search long to find the key, a small, unremarkable thing that felt too insignificant for all the trouble I had gone through. As I walked out of the building, the key burning a hole in my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just crossed a line. This wasn't like the other tasks. This was different. I had taken something that didn't belong to me, something that felt important in a way I couldn't quite understand. When I returned to the cafe, the man was waiting for me. I handed him the key and he gave me a nod of approval, as if I had passed some kind of test. "Good," he said, slipping the key into his pocket. "1 down, 2 to go." I didn't have the energy to ask what the other 2 tasks were. I just wanted to be done with it, to be free of this nightmare. But I knew better than to ask questions. I would find out soon enough, whether I wanted to or not. The next day, I received another text, this one instructing me to meet at a different location, an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. I didn't want to go, but I knew I had to. The second person on the list was the young woman with the child. The instructions were vague, just like before. I was to find her, follow her, and retrieve another item, a small box she carried with her at all times. The instructions didn't say what was in the box, just that it was important. I spent the entire day following her, feeling more and more like a predator with each passing hour. She seemed normal enough, going about her day with her young son, completely unaware of the danger she was in. I hated myself for what I was about to do, but I couldn't stop. The fear of what would happen if I failed kept me going. By the time I made my move, it was late in the evening. She was walking home with her son when I approached her. I didn't have to say anything. I just grabbed the box from her hand and ran. She screamed, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The guilt was crushing, but the fear was stronger. When I returned to the warehouse, I handed the box over to the man without a word. He didn't even bother opening it, just gave me a nod and told me to leave. I was halfway to my car when I heard the sound of a child crying, and I knew it was her son. I had torn something precious away from them, and for what? A debt I had foolishly taken on, a mistake that had spiraled out of control. There was only one more task left, and by this point, I was barely holding it together. The last person on the list was the elderly woman in the wheelchair. The instructions were the same. Follow her, take what was needed, and deliver it to the man. But this time, the item wasn't a key or a box. It was something far more disturbing. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band that she wore on her frail finger. I followed her for days, waiting for the right moment. She lived in a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town, all alone. I watched as she went about her daily routine, the loneliness etched into every movement. She didn't have anyone, no visitors, no family, just the memories of a life that had passed her by. When the time finally came, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I stood outside her house, the fear and guilt battling inside me, and for the first time I considered running. But I knew there was no escape. The man would find me, and the consequences would be far worse than anything I could imagine. So, I did it. I knocked on her door, pretending to be someone offering help, and when she let me in, I took the ring from her frail finger. She didn't resist. She just looked at me with eyes filled with sadness and betrayal. I left her there sitting in her chair as I walked away with the final piece of my debt. When I delivered the ring to the man, he didn't say anything. He just took it, slipped it into his pocket, and turned away. I stood there waiting for some acknowledgement that it was over, that my debt was cleared. But all he said was, "You're free to go." I didn't ask any questions. I didn't want to know what the key opened, what was in the box, or why the ring was so important. I just wanted to get out of there, to put as much distance between myself and this nightmare as possible. But even as I walked away, I knew it wasn't over. The fear, the guilt, they would stay with me, a constant reminder of the mistake I had made. I had paid off my debt, but at what cost? I had crossed lines I never thought I would, done things that would haunt me for the rest of my life. And deep down, I knew that no matter how far I ran, I would never truly be free. You'd think that after finishing the last task, I'd feel some sense of relief. But that's not how it works when you've been dragged through the kind of darkness I'd just survived. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel anything, really. Just this deep, gnawing emptiness where the fear used to be. It was like all the adrenaline had drained out of me, leaving me hollow. After the man told me I was free to go, I didn't look back. I drove straight home, barely seeing the road through the fog in my mind. The whole time I kept expecting something to happen, a car to follow me, a text on the burner phone, maybe even another task. But nothing came. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt like I was living in some kind of limbo, not quite convinced that it was really over. For a few days, I tried to resume my life as if nothing had happened. I went to work, made small talk with my coworkers, paid my bills like any normal person. But it was all an act. I felt disconnected from everything, like I was watching my life from the outside. The people I'd hurt, the things I'd done, it was like they were shadows following me, whispering reminders that I could never go back to the way things were. Then, one night, about a week after I handed over that last item, the doorbell rang. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting, and immediately, my heart was in my throat. I hesitated before answering, every nerve on edge. When I finally did open the door, I half expected to see the man in the suit standing there, ready to pull me back into his web. But it wasn't him. Instead, it was a delivery guy holding a plain brown package. He handed it to me without a word, just a nod before turning and disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the package, my mind racing with all the possibilities of what it could be. It had no return address, no markings, nothing that gave away where it had come from or who had sent it. Against my better judgment, I brought the package inside and set it on the kitchen table. I sat down in front of it, just staring, too afraid to open it, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Whatever was inside, I had to know. So, with shaky hands, I tore off the tape and opened the box. Inside was something I recognized immediately, a familiar black duffel bag. The same one I had used to deliver that stack of cash to the old man in the apartment. But that wasn't all. There was also a small white envelope sitting on top of the bag. My name was written on it in neat, precise handwriting. I could barely breathe as I opened the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. The letter was short, just a few lines. Your debt is paid. But the world is full of debts and those who collect them. Should you need our services again, you know how to find us. That was it. No signature, no name, just those chilling words. It was as if they were daring me to reach out again, to fall back into their clutches. I wanted to scream, to tear the letter apart, to burn the whole package and pretend I had never seen it. But I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, paralyzed by the realization that I was still connected to them, no matter how much I wanted to believe I was free. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there staring at the duffel bag, the letter, trying to make sense of everything. The man in the suit, the tasks, the items I had stolen. What was it all for? What had I really been involved in? I had so many questions but no answers, and that terrified me more than anything else. It was like I had been a pawn in some game I didn't understand, moved around without knowing the rules or the stakes. The next few days were a blur. I tried to keep going, to push forward, but the weight of everything was crushing me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the people I had wronged. The man in the suit, the young mother, the elderly woman, and I couldn't escape the guilt. I started avoiding people, isolating myself more and more, afraid that somehow they would see the darkness I was carrying with me. Then one morning I woke up to find an unfamiliar car parked outside my house. It was a sleek black sedan, the kind that practically screamed, "Don't ask questions." My stomach twisted into knots as I watched it from behind the curtains, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, that it wasn't connected to everything that had happened, but deep down I knew better. The car stayed there all day, just sitting, as if whoever was inside was waiting for something. I couldn't bring myself to leave the house, couldn't even go near the windows without feeling a wave of panic. By the time night fell, I was a complete wreck, pacing around the house, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even tell them? That I had borrowed money from the dark web and now some shadowy figure was stalking me. They'd think I was crazy. As the hours dragged on, I started to question everything. Was this some kind of test? Was I still being watched, judged? The paranoia was eating away at me, and I could feel myself unraveling. By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the burner phone, the one I hadn't touched since the final task, and dialed the number that had haunted me for so long. It rang once, twice, and then nothing. The line went dead. No voice, no instructions, just silence. I tried calling again, but it was the same. I was cut off, severed from the lifeline I had hated and relied on in equal measure. It was like they had taken everything from me and then disappeared, leaving me to pick up the pieces on my own. The car was gone the next morning, but the damage was done. I knew I couldn't stay there, couldn't keep living in that house with the memories and the ghosts of what I'd done. So I packed up and left, moved to a new city, changed my number, tried to start over, but no matter where I went, that package, that letter, followed me. I still have the duffel bag, though I've never opened it. It sits in the back of my closet, a constant reminder of the price I paid for that money and the shadow it cast over my life. Sometimes I think about throwing it away, but I never do. It's like a chain that I can't break, no matter how far I run. I haven't heard from them since, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching, waiting. The fear has dulled over time, but it's never really gone. I still see the faces of the people I wronged in my dreams, and I wonder what became of them. Did they move on, or were they dragged into the darkness just like I was? I've tried to rebuild my life, to put the past behind me, but it's always there, lurking in the corners of my mind. I know now that there are things you can never truly escape, no matter how hard you try. And the worst part is, I have no one to blame but myself, because in the end, it was my choice to borrow that money, my choice to make that deal. And now I'm the one who has to live with the consequences. That's the real horror of it all. The knowledge that I did this to myself, that I'm the one who let the darkness in. And even though I've moved on, or at least tried to, I know that it's only a matter of time before the past catches up with me. Because debts like mine don't just disappear. They linger, they fester, and eventually they come due. Months passed and life continued, but it was never quite the same. I'd relocated, gotten a new job, even made a few new friends, but everything felt like it was built on shaky ground. The fear and paranoia had dulled, but they never went away completely. Every time the phone rang or someone knocked on my door, my heart would skip a beat, expecting the worst. For a while, I managed to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, I had escaped. The man in the suit, the tasks, the shadowy organization, they had all disappeared as quickly as they had entered my life. I tried to focus on the present, to rebuild, but the past clung to me like a stain I couldn't wash out. Then one evening, as I was heading home from work, I noticed something odd. A man I'd never seen before was standing across the street from my apartment. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, just standing there looking in my direction. But the moment our eyes met, a chill ran through me. There was something too familiar about the way he carried himself, the way he seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept replaying the scene in my mind. The way he looked at me, the slight nod he gave as I turned away. It was too much like the man in the suit, too much like the beginning of something I didn't want to face again. The next morning, the man was gone, but the unease remained. I went about my day trying to focus on work, but my mind was elsewhere. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, like the life I had tried to build was about to crumble. By the time I got home that evening, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. When I reached my apartment door, I found a small, unmarked envelope waiting for me on the floor. My hands shook as I picked it up, dreading what it might contain. I knew without even opening it that my past had finally caught up with me. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it slowly, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words written in that same neat, precise handwriting. You thought you were free, but debts like yours never truly end. We'll be in touch. I dropped the letter, my hands trembling. It was happening all over again. The nightmare I thought I'd escaped was starting anew, and this time I knew there would be no running, no hiding. They had let me believe I was free, only to remind me that I never really was. Days turned into weeks, and I waited, dread filling every waking moment. I expected the phone to ring, for another envelope to appear, for the man in the suit to return with a new list of tasks. But nothing happened. The silence was worse than the threats. It was the anticipation of the unknown, the certainty that something was coming, even if I didn't know what or when. I tried to go about my life, pretending that everything was normal, but the fear gnawed at me constantly. I became more isolated, afraid to let anyone get close. I didn't want them to get caught up in whatever was coming, didn't want to put anyone else at risk. The guilt of what I had already done weighed heavily on me, and the thought of dragging someone else into my mess was unbearable. One night, after another long, sleepless stretch, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to do something, even if it meant walking straight into whatever trap they were setting for me. I needed answers, closure, anything to end this torment. So I did the only thing I could think of. I went back to the dark web. I told myself I was just looking for information, that I wouldn't get involved again, but deep down I knew I was lying to myself. It didn't take long to find the forum where it had all started, the same plain thread that had promised easy money. I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the mouse, knowing that once I clicked, there was no turning back. When I finally did, it was like stepping into a time machine. The same contact form, the same promises. It was all still there, waiting for the next desperate fool to fall into its trap. I filled out the form, this time leaving a message in the comments section. I know who you are. I want to talk. I wasn't expecting a response. I didn't even know if anyone was still monitoring the thread, but the very next day I received an email. It was from the same collector who had first contacted me over a year ago, the one who had started this whole mess. The message was simple: meet me, same place, same time. There it was, the confirmation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. They wanted to meet, just like before. This time, though, I wasn't as naive. I knew this wasn't going to be a friendly chat, but I had to go. I had to see it through to find out what they wanted from me. That night, I went to the cafe, my heart pounding in my chest. The place was almost empty, just like before, and the man in the suit was sitting in the same booth waiting for me. As I approached, he looked up, that same cold smile on his face. "You came," he said, as if there had never been any doubt. "I want to know what this is about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why won't you leave me alone? I did everything you asked. I paid off the debt." He leaned back, studying me with those emotionless eyes. "You paid off the debt you borrowed, yes, but that's not how this works. You didn't just borrow money. You became part of something bigger, something you can't walk away from." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "You're useful," he said simply. "And in our line of work, we don't let useful people go so easily. You've proven yourself capable, resourceful. You're a part of this now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're saying, what, that I work for you now?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he slid another envelope across the table. I stared at it, not wanting to touch it, but knowing I had no choice. When I opened it, I found another task, another person to follow, another item to retrieve. "This isn't a debt," he said, his voice as cold as ever. "This is an opportunity. We can make your life very comfortable if you cooperate. But if you refuse..." He didn't need to finish that sentence. The threat was clear. I sat there, the weight of the envelope in my hands, realizing that I was trapped in a way I hadn't fully understood before. I wasn't just paying off a debt. I was being pulled deeper into their world, a world where debts never end and freedom is just an illusion. When I left the cafe that night, I knew there was no escaping them. I could run, change my name, disappear completely, but they would always find me. And now, with this new task, I had a choice to make. Do I continue down this path, becoming more entangled in their web, or do I refuse, knowing that the consequences would be severe? I still have that envelope, unopened, sitting on my kitchen table. I haven't decided what to do yet, but every day that passes, I feel the walls closing in a little more. I know that whatever choice I make, there's no going back to the life I once had. The debt I borrowed was just the beginning. Now it seems I'm paying off something much bigger, something that can never truly be repaid. And the worst part? I'm starting to think that, deep down, I always knew this would happen. That once you let the darkness in, it never really lets you go. So if you ever find yourself desperate enough to consider borrowing money from the dark web, remember my story. Remember that what they offer isn't just money, and what they take from you isn't just repayment, it's your life, and once they have it, they won't ever let it go. I suppose I should start by saying that my brother Mark was always a bit of an oddball. He was the kind of guy who preferred staying up late reading obscure conspiracy theories rather than hanging out with friends or even sleeping. But despite his quirks, he was brilliant, smarter than anyone I knew. He was the kind of person who could hack into anything and figure out the most complex problems in seconds. The thing is, he was also incredibly paranoid, and while we all chalked it up to his overactive imagination, maybe we should have taken it more seriously. Mark disappeared 2 years ago. No one saw it coming, but in hindsight, the signs were there. He'd become increasingly reclusive, spending more time locked away in his room, tapping away at his keyboard. When we asked him what he was up to, he'd just shrug and say something cryptic like, "Just working on a project." Then one day, he was gone. No note, no phone call, nothing. My parents were devastated, but the police didn't seem all that concerned. They said it wasn't uncommon for young adults to up and leave without warning, especially ones like Mark. But I knew better. Mark wouldn't just disappear like that without a reason. Weeks turned into months, and eventually we were forced to accept that Mark wasn't coming back. The police officially declared him dead after a year of no contact, citing the lack of evidence to suggest otherwise. It was like he had vanished off the face of the earth, leaving nothing behind but his old computer and a bunch of books on quantum physics and encryption. I was the one who cleared out his room. I don't know why, but it felt like something I had to do. Maybe it was my way of saying goodbye. As I packed up his things, I found his laptop, still plugged in and gathering dust. I didn't have the heart to turn it on, though. It felt too invasive, like I'd be digging through his last remaining thoughts, his last moments before he disappeared. So, I just put it in a box with the rest of his stuff and shoved it into the attic. Life moved on after that, but I never really did. Mark's disappearance haunted me. I kept replaying everything in my mind, wondering if I'd missed something, some clue that could have told me where he went or why he left. But no matter how many times I went over it, nothing made sense. It wasn't until last month that things started to change. I had just moved into my own place, a tiny apartment in the city. I'd been unpacking, going through some old boxes when I found Mark's laptop again. It felt like a punch to the gut seeing it after all this time. For a moment, I just stared at it, debating whether or not to turn it on, but something inside me said I needed to know. Whatever it was, I had to find out. So, I powered it up. The screen flickered to life, and I was met with Mark's familiar desktop wallpaper, a picture of some obscure fractal pattern that I never really understood. There was nothing unusual about it at first, just a bunch of folders filled with his work, programming scripts, notes on various theories, that kind of stuff. But then I found a folder buried deep within the system, hidden away behind layers of encryption. It was labeled Echo. I don't know how long I stared at that folder before I finally opened it. Inside, there were hundreds of files, all with names that didn't make any sense. Strings of numbers and letters, some of which looked more like codes than actual file names. My heart was racing, and for the first time since Mark disappeared, I felt like I was onto something. But what I found in those files was beyond anything I could have imagined. The first file I opened was a text document, but it was just a bunch of random words and phrases strung together in what seemed like a completely nonsensical manner. At first, I thought it was gibberish, but then I noticed a pattern. Every fifth word formed a sentence, something that read more like a warning than anything else. They are watching. Trust no one. Find the key. The other files were even stranger. Maps of locations I didn't recognize, logs of conversations in code, and screenshots of what looked like deep web forums. Some of the images were just black, but when I brightened them up I could make out faint outlines, shapes that didn't make any sense, almost like something was trying to stay hidden. Then I found a video. It was the only video in the entire folder, and it was only a few minutes long. The thumbnail showed Mark sitting at his desk, looking more haggard and tired than I'd ever seen him. My hand was shaking as I clicked play. "Hey sis," he said, his voice shaky and strained. "If you're seeing this, then I guess they got to me. I'm sorry. I never wanted to drag you into this, but I didn't have a choice." He paused, glancing over his shoulder like he was afraid someone was watching. "There's something out there, something big," he continued. "I found it by accident. I don't even know what it is exactly, but it's dangerous, more dangerous than anything you can imagine. And now they're after me. I don't know how long I can keep running, but you need to stay away from this. Stay away from me. If they find out you know anything, they won't hesitate. Just forget about me, okay? Live your life." The video ended abruptly after that, leaving me staring at a blank screen. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process what I'd just seen. Mark was alive, or at least he was when he recorded that video. But he was running from something that had the power to make people disappear without a trace. My brother wasn't dead, he was hiding, and whatever he'd discovered, it was enough to put his life, and possibly mine, in danger. I knew I should have stopped there, but I couldn't. I had to know more. I had to find out what Mark had stumbled onto that was so dangerous it made him vanish off the grid. That's when I made the decision to dive into the deep web myself. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. The deep web isn't some dark corner of the internet where you can just poke around without consequence. It's a place where the wrong click can lead you into a world of trouble. But I wasn't thinking about that then. All I cared about was finding my brother. What I found, well, that's a story for another day. But let's just say, I'm starting to understand why Mark was so afraid. After discovering the video on Mark's laptop, I knew I was in over my head. But curiosity, or maybe it was desperation, kept pulling me deeper. I couldn't just let it go. My brother was out there somewhere, and he was terrified. I couldn't ignore that. The problem was I had no idea where to start. The files on Mark's laptop were encrypted with levels of security that I barely understood, and I was no hacker. I didn't know how to decode them, but I was determined to learn. The first few nights were spent watching tutorials, scouring forums, and piecing together bits of information. It felt like learning a new language, but gradually, things started to make sense. I became obsessed, spending every spare moment trying to crack the codes Mark left behind. After a few weeks, I finally managed to decrypt one of the files. It was a chat log, but the names of the participants were all masked. The conversation itself was unsettling. Mark was talking to someone who seemed to know a lot more than he did. They were discussing something called Project Echo. The person on the other end kept insisting that Mark needed to be careful, that he was getting too close to something dangerous. Mark's replies were anxious, almost frantic. He was asking questions about an organization that was mentioned several times, but the responses were always vague, dodging his inquiries. Whoever this person was, they were scared too. One phrase stood out to me, something Mark's contact said near the end of the conversation. "Once you see the truth, there's no going back." That line haunted me. It echoed in my mind every time I tried to sleep, and it drove me deeper into my investigation. I couldn't let it go, even though every part of me knew that digging into this was a bad idea. Eventually, I decided to do something I swore I'd never do. I went on the deep web. Now I know what you're thinking. Bad idea, right? You're not wrong. But I felt like I had no other choice. Mark had left breadcrumbs leading to something, and the only way to follow them was to go where he'd gone. Getting onto the deep web was easier than I expected, but it was nothing like I imagined. It wasn't all dark and creepy like the horror stories make it out to be. At first glance, it was just a series of plain websites with strange URLs, no graphics, no frills. But there was an underlying tension, a feeling that I'd entered a place where I didn't belong. I started searching for anything related to Project Echo. It was slow going at first. Most of what I found were dead ends, old forums with no recent activity, encrypted files I couldn't open, and vague references that didn't mean anything to me. But then I stumbled onto something different. It was a forum, but this one was active, with recent posts discussing topics that were eerily similar to what I'd seen in Mark's files. People were talking about something called the pattern, a term that kept coming up alongside mentions of Project Echo. The conversations were cryptic, with users warning each other to be careful, to not dig too deep. Some of the posts were just strings of numbers or letters, almost like code, but others were more direct. There were warnings, people saying that they'd been followed, that strange things were happening to them after they started looking into the pattern. I found a thread started by someone with the username Watcher, and it caught my eye because it had dozens of replies. Watcher claimed to have proof of something big, something that tied Project Echo to events happening around the world. Disappearances, strange deaths, accidents that didn't make the news. According to Watcher, these weren't coincidences. They were all connected, part of a larger operation that was being covered up. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I sent Watcher a private message. I kept it simple, just asking if they knew anything about Mark, or if Project Echo had anything to do with him. I didn't expect a reply, but it felt like the only lead I had. A few days passed, and I started to think I'd never hear back. But then, late one night, a message popped up in my inbox. It was from Watcher. "I've been waiting for you," the message read. "I know who your brother is and I know what happened to him. If you want to know the truth, meet me at the coordinates below. Come alone. Trust no one." Attached to the message was a set of GPS coordinates. I checked the location. It was a spot in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods about 3 hours from my apartment. The whole thing screamed trap, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was my only chance to find out what happened to Mark. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I knew if I did, they'd try to stop me. So I packed a bag with some essentials, made sure my phone was fully charged, and set off the next morning. The drive was long, and the closer I got to the coordinates, the more isolated the area became. The roads turned into dirt paths, and eventually I had to park my car and walk the rest of the way. The forest was dense and quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. I followed the coordinates, my phone's GPS leading me deeper into the woods. It was unsettling, knowing that I was walking into the unknown, but I had come too far to turn back now. Finally, I reached the location. It was a small clearing with a single rundown cabin in the center. The windows were boarded up, and the door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. My heart was pounding as I approached, every instinct telling me to leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. I knocked on the door, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then I heard the sound of footsteps from inside, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open just a crack, and I saw a pair of eyes peering out at me. "You're late," the person said, their voice low and rough. They opened the door a bit wider, revealing a figure cloaked in shadows. "Come in. We don't have much time." I hesitated for just a second before stepping inside. The door closed behind me with a heavy thud, and I found myself standing in a dimly lit room filled with old newspapers, maps, and documents pinned to the walls. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. The person, Watcher, I assumed, motioned for me to sit at a small, rickety table. They didn't sit themselves, instead opting to stand in the shadows, their face still obscured. "I know why you're here," Watcher said, their voice barely above a whisper. "Your brother was onto something he shouldn't have been. Project Echo. It's not just a theory, it's real, and it's bigger than you can imagine." I opened my mouth to ask a question, but Watcher cut me off. "No questions, not yet," they said. "You need to listen carefully. If you want to survive, you have to know what you're up against." And that's when Watcher began to explain. They told me about an organization, one that operated in the shadows, hidden from the public eye. They weren't part of any government, at least not officially, but they had power. Real power. Enough to make people disappear, to alter events on a global scale without anyone noticing. Project Echo was one of their operations. But it wasn't the only one. There were others, all connected by something called the pattern. A series of events that, when put together, revealed a hidden agenda, something far more sinister than I could have imagined. According to Watcher, Mark had stumbled onto the pattern by accident. He had been piecing together clues, following the breadcrumbs just like I was, but he'd gotten too close. They couldn't let him expose what he'd found, so they made him disappear. But Mark was smart, smarter than they'd anticipated. He'd gone underground, faked his own death, and started leaving clues for someone to find. "Someone like you," Watcher said, finally stepping out of the shadows. They were older than I expected, with a face lined by years of worry and fear. He knew you'd come looking for him, and he knew they'd come after you too. I felt a chill run down my spine as the weight of Watcher's words sank in. If what they were saying was true, then I wasn't just searching for my brother. I was stepping into the same danger he had, a danger that could swallow me whole if I wasn't careful. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Watcher gave me a long, hard look before replying. "You do exactly what your brother did," they said. "You go off the grid, you hide, and you pray they don't find you before you find him." With that, Watcher handed me a small envelope, sealed and marked with a single word: trust. "Inside you'll find what you need to know," Watcher said, moving toward the door. "But once you open it, there's no turning back. Make sure you're ready." I took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of it as if it held all the answers I'd been searching for. But deep down I knew that opening it would change everything. Watcher opened the door, letting the cool breeze of the forest night seep into the cabin. "Good luck," they said, their voice filled with a solemn finality. "You're going to need it." And with that, I stepped back out into the night, the envelope clutched tightly in my hand, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't open the envelope right away. After leaving Watcher's cabin, I drove back home in a daze, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking time bomb. The road blurred past me as I tried to process everything I'd just heard. My brother was alive, hiding from an organization that could make people vanish without a trace. And now, I was part of it too. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was early morning. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, casting an eerie glow on the empty streets. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me as if that could somehow keep the danger at bay. The envelope was still in my hand, the word trust staring back at me like a challenge. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope for what felt like hours. My mind was racing with questions, doubts, and fears. What if this was all a trap? What if opening this envelope put me in even more danger? But then I thought of Mark and the look in his eyes in that video. He was scared, yes, but he was also determined. He wanted me to find him, to understand what he'd uncovered. And this envelope was the next step. So, I took a deep breath and tore it open. Inside was a small USB drive and a handwritten note from Watcher. The note was short, written in a hurried scrawl that matched the urgency in Watcher's voice from the night before. "Plug this in, follow the instructions, trust no one." I held the USB drive in my hand, feeling the cold metal against my skin. It was small, unassuming, but I knew that whatever was on it was important. Important enough to get Mark to disappear and Watcher to risk meeting me in person. My heart was pounding as I walked over to my brother's old laptop, the same one I'd found in that dusty box just weeks ago. The screen flickered to life, and I hesitated for just a moment before plugging in the USB drive. The computer made a soft beep as it recognized the device, and a single file popped up on the screen. It was labeled readmefirst.txt. I clicked on it, and the document opened in a plain text editor. The instructions were simple, almost too simple. Run the program. Follow the prompts. Do not deviate. My hands were shaking as I double-clicked on the program. The screen went black for a few seconds, and then a terminal window appeared filled with lines of code that scrolled by too fast for me to read. After a few moments, the scrolling stopped, and a new prompt appeared on the screen. Enter your name. I hesitated, but there was no turning back now. I typed in my name and hit enter. The screen changed again, this time displaying a series of maps, diagrams, and files. It looked like a chaotic mess at first glance, but as I started clicking through the tabs, I realized it was organized, meticulously so. There were maps of different locations, some of which I recognized, and others that were completely foreign to me. There were lists of names, dates, and events, some highlighted in red, others in blue. But the most unsettling part was the folder labeled Echo Project. Inside, I found more documents, all encrypted with layers of security that would take me days to crack. But there were a few files that were accessible, including one that caught my eye. marklastmessage.txt. With my heart in my throat, I clicked on the file. A text document opened, and I started to read. Hey, if you're reading this, it means you found the USB. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything in person, but it was too dangerous. If you're following my trail, then you need to know the truth about Project Echo. It's not just a theory or a conspiracy. It's real, and it's more dangerous than you can imagine. Mark's words were direct, urgent. He described how he'd stumbled onto Project Echo while researching unrelated topics. It started with small connections, strange coincidences that didn't make sense until he dug deeper. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that these weren't coincidences at all. They were deliberate actions, part of a larger plan orchestrated by an organization that operated in complete secrecy. The pattern, Mark wrote, is the key to everything. It's a series of events that, when put together, reveal the true scope of Project Echo. It's not just about control or power. It's about something bigger, something that could change the world if it gets out. He didn't explain exactly what the pattern was, but he did mention several locations, places where events had occurred that didn't make sense on their own but were crucial when viewed together. He also warned that the organization behind Project Echo had eyes everywhere. They could manipulate media, control information, and make people disappear without a trace. I had to go underground, Mark wrote. They were getting too close, and I couldn't risk leading them to you or anyone else. But I'm still working, still trying to uncover the truth. If you want to help, you need to find the key. It's the only way to unlock the rest of the files and understand what's really going on. The message ended there, leaving me with more questions than answers. What was the pattern? And what was this key that Mark mentioned? I went back to the main folder and found another file labeled instructions.txt. It was a guide detailing how to access certain parts of the deep web, specific forums to visit, and even codes to enter that would lead me to more information about Project Echo. It was clear that Mark had planned for this, anticipating that I might follow in his footsteps. But he also made it clear that this was dangerous, more dangerous than anything I'd ever encountered. I spent the next few days following the instructions, diving deeper into the dark corners of the internet where Mark had left breadcrumbs for me to find. The forums were filled with people who spoke in riddles, their messages cryptic and hard to decipher. But the more I read, the more I started to understand. Project Echo wasn't just about controlling information or manipulating events. It was about rewriting reality itself. The pattern, as Mark described it, was a sequence of events that, when triggered in a specific way, could alter the course of history. The organization behind it was using the pattern to shape the world according to their agenda, and anyone who got too close to uncovering the truth was silenced. As I dug deeper, I started to notice things, small details that didn't make sense. People on the forums who had been active suddenly disappeared. Threads were deleted without warning, and some users claimed they were being watched or followed. It was as if the closer I got to understanding the pattern, the more the world around me started to shift. But I couldn't stop. I needed to find Mark, to warn him, to help him finish what he'd started. I needed to find the key. One night, as I was poring over the files again, trying to decode the last encrypted document, I received an email. It was from a sender I didn't recognize, with no subject line. The message was short, just 2 words. Too late. A chill ran through me as I stared at the screen. My mind raced, trying to figure out who could have sent it, but before I could react, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from an unknown number, with a single link attached. I hesitated, knowing this could be another trap, but curiosity got the better of me. I clicked the link, and it took me to a live video feed. The screen was dark at first, but then it flickered, showing a familiar place. A room I recognized all too well. It was my brother's room, the one he'd disappeared from 2 years ago. The camera was positioned in the corner overlooking his desk. Papers were scattered across it, and in the center was Mark's old laptop, the same one I was using now. But the room wasn't empty. In the dim light, I could make out a figure sitting at the desk, their back to the camera. The figure was hunched over, typing furiously on the keyboard. "Mark?" I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. The figure stopped typing, as if they'd heard me, and slowly turned around. The feed cut out before I could see their face, leaving me staring at a blank screen once again. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was Mark still alive? Was he still working on this even now? And if he was, why hadn't he contacted me directly? The questions swirled in my mind, but one thing was clear. I was closer than ever to uncovering the truth. But with each step forward, the danger grew. And now, whoever was behind Project Echo knew that I was getting too close. I had to act fast. There was no telling how much time I had left before they found me too. And whatever Mark had discovered, whatever this key was, it was the only thing that could save us both. The live feed haunted me for days. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in Mark's room. Was it really him? Or was this some kind of elaborate trick? The video had cut out before I could see their face, but deep down I knew. Somehow I knew it was Mark. But what I didn't understand was why he hadn't reached out to me directly, or how he could still be using the same laptop I had in my possession. The sense of urgency was growing. Every second felt like I was one step closer to the truth, but also one step closer to something I wasn't sure I could handle. I threw myself into the search, poring over the documents, maps, and files Mark had left behind. The phrase, "find the key," echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that there was something crucial I was missing. One night, as I was combing through Mark's files for what felt like the 100th time, I stumbled upon something new. It was a series of numbers, hidden within the metadata of one of the encrypted documents. At first, they didn't make any sense, just a long string of digits that seemed random. But then, I remembered something Mark used to talk about, back when we were kids and he was just starting to get into cryptography. "Every code has a key," he'd say with that annoying smirk of his. "You just have to know where to look." Could these numbers be a key? My heart pounded as I copied them down, trying to think of how they could be used. It wasn't just a simple code, it was too long and too complex for that. But then it hit me. Coordinates. The numbers were latitude and longitude, pointing to a specific location. I quickly plugged the coordinates into a map. The location that popped up was in the middle of nowhere, deep in the mountains about 5 hours from where I lived. It was a remote area, far from any towns or cities, the kind of place where you wouldn't just stumble upon something by accident. My first thought was that this had to be another safe house or a meeting spot, maybe even where Mark was hiding. But there was no way to know for sure without going there myself. I didn't waste any time. I packed a bag with the essentials: water, food, a flashlight, and of course Mark's laptop. I also brought along the USB drive and a portable power bank. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I wanted to be as prepared as possible. The drive out to the mountains was long and exhausting, but the entire time, my mind was racing with possibilities. What if this was the key Mark had mentioned? What if I was about to find the missing piece that would unlock everything? But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone, or something, was aware of every move I was making. By the time I reached the coordinates, it was late afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the dense forest that surrounded the area. I parked the car at the side of an old dirt road and continued on foot, following the map on my phone. The path was rough, overgrown with weeds and bushes that hadn't been touched in years. It was clear that this place hadn't seen many visitors, if any at all. After about an hour of hiking, I reached the exact spot the coordinates pointed to. But there was nothing there, just a small clearing surrounded by trees with no buildings or structures in sight. My heart sank as I looked around, feeling a surge of frustration. Had I come all this way for nothing? Was this just another dead end? But then something caught my eye, a small metallic glint among the leaves. I pushed aside some branches and found a metal hatch, half buried in the dirt. It was old and rusted, but it had been recently disturbed. My pulse quickened as I knelt down and tried to pry it open. The hatch groaned as it gave way, revealing a dark, narrow staircase descending into the earth. I hesitated, staring into the abyss below. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I knew I couldn't. I'd come too far. I took a deep breath, switched on my flashlight, and started down the stairs. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. The walls were made of rough stone, and the staircase spiraled down much farther than I had expected. It felt like I was descending into the depths of the earth itself. After what felt like an eternity, the stairs ended, and I found myself in a small, underground chamber. The room was empty except for a single object in the center, a large metal box. It was plain, unmarked, and secured with a heavy-duty lock. My hands were trembling as I approached it, the flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. There was no keyhole, no obvious way to open it. But as I ran my fingers over the surface, I found a small panel that slid open, revealing a keypad. My mind raced as I tried to think of what the code could be, and then it hit me, the numbers from the coordinates. I quickly typed them in, my breath catching as the lock clicked open. I lifted the lid slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. Inside the box was a small black notebook and a folded piece of paper. The notebook was well worn, the pages filled with Mark's cramped handwriting. I picked it up and started flipping through it, my eyes scanning the entries. It was a journal detailing everything Mark had discovered about Project Echo, the pattern, and the organization behind it. But what struck me the most were the last few entries. They're getting closer. I can feel it. I don't know how much time I have left, but I need to finish this. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. You need to understand. The pattern isn't just a series of events. It's a code, a way of rewriting reality. They've been using it to manipulate everything, history, politics, even people's lives. And if they succeed in completing it, they'll have control over everything. You have to stop them. The key is... The entry ended abruptly, the rest of the page torn out. My heart sank as I realized the crucial piece of information was missing. I searched the box frantically, but there was no sign of the missing page. The folded piece of paper was still there, and with shaking hands I unfolded it. It was a map, marked with several locations around the world, places that, according to Mark's notes, were all part of the pattern. But there was something else on the map, something that sent a chill down my spine. At the bottom, in Mark's handwriting, were the words, "The final piece is here." I stared at the map, trying to make sense of it. The locations were spread out across the globe, but one spot was circled multiple times. It was a place I recognized from Mark's notes, a remote island that was practically inaccessible. I had no idea how I was going to get there, but I knew that this was it. This was where the pattern would be completed, where the final piece of the puzzle lay. But before I could think any further, I heard a noise from the staircase behind me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. My heart leapt into my throat as I realized I wasn't alone. I quickly shoved the notebook and map into my bag and closed the box, backing away toward the far wall. The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the chamber as someone or something descended the stairs. I switched off my flashlight, plunging the room into darkness, and pressed myself against the cold stone wall, trying to steady my breathing. The figures stepped into the chamber, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light. I could just make out the outline of a tall, thin man, his movements deliberate and methodical as he scanned the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized this wasn't just some random person. This was someone sent by the organization, someone who knew exactly where to find me. I held my breath, praying that he wouldn't see me. The man took a few steps closer to the box, his hand reaching out to lift the lid. For a moment, I thought he might leave after seeing it was empty, but then he paused, his head turning slightly in my direction. I could feel his eyes on me, even in the darkness. "Come out," he said, his voice calm and cold. "I know you're here." My mind raced, searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. The only way out was up those stairs, but he was blocking the path. I had to think fast. Without warning, I grabbed a small rock from the ground and threw it as hard as I could toward the opposite side of the chamber. It clattered loudly against the stone wall, the sound echoing through the room. The man turned sharply toward the noise, and in that split second, I made my move. I bolted for the stairs, moving as quietly as possible in the darkness. My heart pounded in my ears as I took the steps two at a time, desperate to reach the surface before he realized what was happening. I could hear his footsteps behind me, faster now, gaining on me with every second. I burst out of the hatch and into the cold night air, my lungs burning as I sprinted toward the trees. I didn't dare look back, knowing that he was right behind me. The forest was thick, the underbrush tearing at my clothes and slowing me down, but I pushed on, my only thought to put as much distance between us as possible. Finally, I reached the road where I'd parked my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I unlocked the door and jumped inside. The engine roared to life and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the dirt road as fast as I could. As the trees blurred past me, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man chasing after me, but the road was empty. I didn't slow down until I was miles away, back on the main highway, and surrounded by the familiar lights of civilization. I pulled over at a rest stop, my hands still shaking as I tried to catch my breath. The events of the past hour replayed in my mind like a nightmare, but one thing was clear. I had the final piece of the puzzle. Mark's notes, the map, the key. All of it was leading me to one place, the island. But whatever was waiting for me there, I knew it was going to be dangerous. This was it, the culmination of everything Mark had been working on, everything he'd been running from. And now, it was up to me to finish what he started. I didn't know if I was ready, but I didn't have a choice. The final piece of the pattern was waiting, and I had to find it before they did. Because if they succeeded, everything, our lives, our reality, could be rewritten. After the chase through the woods and the narrow escape, I barely slept. My mind was a tangled mess of fear, adrenaline, and the overwhelming realization that I was now part of something far bigger than I ever imagined. Mark's cryptic notes, the near miss with the man in the underground chamber, and the looming sense of danger left me reeling. But there was no time to waste. If I was going to stop whatever was happening, I needed to get to the island. The next morning, I started making preparations. The island, according to the map, was located off the coast of a remote region, accessible only by a small ferry that locals used. It wasn't exactly a tourist destination, just a speck on the map surrounded by rough seas and jagged cliffs, the kind of place people didn't talk about, let alone visit. But Mark had circled it multiple times, and now it was my destination. I packed everything I thought I might need: clothes, food, water, and of course the notebook and USB drive. I didn't know what I would find there, but I had to be ready for anything. The journey was grueling. First, a long drive to the coast, then a few hours waiting for the ferry that ran on its own unpredictable schedule. The locals gave me strange looks when I asked about the island, but no one said much, just muttered something about it being a bad place, and went on their way. The ferry ride itself was unnerving. The boat was small, creaking with every wave, and the sea seemed particularly rough that day. The sky was overcast, the clouds hanging low like a shroud over the ocean. I was the only passenger, and the ferry operator, an old man with a weathered face, said nothing the entire trip. He just stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. As we approached the island, I could see why it wasn't a popular destination. The shoreline was rocky, with steep cliffs rising up from the water. The island was covered in dense forest, dark and foreboding. There were no signs of life, no welcoming harbor, just a small, rickety dock that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The old man pulled the ferry alongside the dock, and I stepped off, my heart pounding in my chest. He didn't say a word, just nodded slightly, before turning the boat around and heading back the way we came. I watched until the ferry disappeared into the fog, leaving me alone on the island. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was almost oppressive. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. I pulled out the map and started following the path that Mark had marked, heading into the forest. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with weeds and brambles, but I pressed on, determined to find whatever it was that Mark had circled. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I began to notice strange things: trees that had been scorched, patches of ground where nothing grew, and most unsettling of all, old rusted equipment scattered among the trees. It looked like some sort of abandoned research site, with decaying buildings and machinery that hadn't been touched in decades. Whatever had happened here, it had been long forgotten, left to rot and disappear. But Mark hadn't forgotten, and neither had the organization. The path led me to a clearing at the center of the island, where the remains of a large building stood. It had once been a facility of some kind, but now it was just a skeleton, walls crumbling, roof caved in. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. This was the place. The final piece of the pattern was somewhere inside. I stepped through the broken doorway, into the dark, abandoned structure. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of dampness and decay. I could hear the distant drip of water from somewhere deep within the building, but otherwise the place was deathly quiet. The only light came from the gaps in the broken roof, casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls. I followed the map to what appeared to be the main chamber, a large room at the center of the facility. It was empty except for a single pedestal in the middle, with a small device resting on top. The device was old, covered in dust, but I could tell it was important. Mark had drawn a large circle around this exact spot on the map, labeling it the conduit. My heart raced as I approached the pedestal, my footsteps echoing in the empty room. The device looked like a small black box with a series of buttons and a screen that was flickering weakly. It was connected to wires that snaked across the floor, leading to various parts of the building. It was as if this device was the heart of whatever had been happening here. I carefully wiped the dust off the screen and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of commands and prompts. It looked like some kind of control panel, but for what? I had no idea. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Mark's notes had mentioned something about rewriting reality, using the pattern to alter the course of events. Was this device part of that process? Was it the key? I pulled out the USB drive and inserted it into the device's port. The screen flashed and a new prompt appeared: enter code. I hesitated, my mind flashing back to Mark's notebook and the coordinates I had used to find the underground chamber. Could it be the same code? I typed in the numbers, my fingers trembling as I hit enter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the screen changed, displaying a series of messages and symbols that made no sense to me. But I could tell that something was happening, something big. The wires on the floor began to hum with energy, and the air in the room grew thick with tension. It was as if the entire facility had come to life, responding to the activation of this ancient device. And then I saw it, a flicker of light in the center of the room, growing brighter and brighter until it formed a shimmering portal, a window into another reality. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into it, seeing glimpses of places, people, events, all of them shifting, changing, like pieces of a puzzle being rearranged. This was the pattern in action, the very thing Mark had warned me about. But something was wrong. The portal was unstable, flickering wildly, as if it couldn't maintain its connection. I could feel the ground trembling beneath me, the walls of the building beginning to shake. Whatever I had activated, it was tearing the fabric of reality apart. I had to stop it. I didn't know how, but I knew that if this continued, the consequences would be catastrophic. I reached for the device, my hands shaking as I tried to figure out how to shut it down. But the controls were foreign to me, the symbols and commands incomprehensible. Then out of the corner of my eye I saw movement. I turned, and there he was, Mark, standing at the entrance to the room. He looked pale, exhausted, but it was him. He met my eyes, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice barely audible over the growing hum of the device. "I didn't want you to get involved in this." "Mark," I whispered, my voice cracking. "What is this? What's happening?" He approached slowly, his eyes filled with a sadness I had never seen before. "This is what they've been trying to control," he said, gesturing to the portal. "The ability to reshape reality, to alter the course of history. But it's too dangerous. I didn't realize how dangerous until it was too late. I wanted to reach out to him, to pull him out of this nightmare, but there was no time." The building was shaking violently now, pieces of the ceiling starting to crumble. The portal was growing more unstable by the second, and I could see that Mark was struggling to stay on his feet. "We have to stop it," I said, my voice filled with desperation. "How do we stop it?" Mark looked at me with a grim expression. "There's only one way," he said. "We have to destroy the device. It's the only thing holding the pattern together." I stared at him, my mind racing. Destroying the device meant destroying everything we had worked to uncover, everything Mark had sacrificed to find. But there was no other choice. The longer the device stayed active, the more damage it would do to our reality. "Do it," I said, my voice firm. "Do whatever you have to do." Mark nodded, a look of determination crossing his face. He moved to the device, his fingers flying over the controls. I could see the strain on his face, the effort it took to override the system. The humming grew louder, the portal flickering violently as the device began to overload. "Get out of here," Mark said, his voice strained. "You need to go, now." "But what about you?" I shouted over the noise. Mark looked at me, his expression softening. "I'll be right behind you. Just go." I hesitated for a moment, but the building was collapsing around us. I turned and ran, sprinting back through the crumbling structure, the ground shaking beneath my feet. I could hear the device behind me, its hum reaching a deafening pitch as it approached critical mass. I burst out of the building and into the forest, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. I didn't stop running until I reached the shore, where the ferry had dropped me off. The island was shaking, the trees swaying violently as if caught in a storm. I looked back toward the facility, just in time to see it explode in a brilliant flash of light. The force of the blast knocked me off my feet, and I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. When I finally managed to sit up, the island was eerily quiet. The facility was gone, reduced to a smoking crater. The portal had vanished, leaving nothing but the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. But Mark was gone too. I searched the island for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. The device had been destroyed, along with the pattern and whatever reality-warping power it held. But at what cost? As the sun began to set, I sat on the dock, staring out at the horizon. The ferry never came back. I was alone, stranded on an island that had taken everything from me. But in my heart, I knew Mark had made the ultimate sacrifice to stop something far worse from happening. In the end, I was rescued by a passing fishing boat the next day. The fishermen baffled by my presence on the island. They didn't ask questions and I didn't offer any explanations. I was just grateful to be alive. Weeks have passed since then and I've returned to my normal life, or at least what passes for normal now. But I still think about Mark, about everything he went through to protect the world from a danger no one will ever know existed. His notes, the USB drive, and the map are all gone, lost in the explosion that destroyed the facility. But the memory of what happened will stay with me forever. I've come to accept that Mark is truly gone this time, but I like to think that somewhere, somehow, he's at peace, knowing that he stopped something truly terrible from happening. As for me, I've learned to live with the uncertainty, the questions that will never be answered. But one thing is clear. I'll never forget the truth of what happened, the reality that could have been rewritten if not for the actions of one brave man. Mark was a hero, even if no one else will ever know. And though I'll carry the weight of his loss forever, I know he did what he had to do. And now it's up to me to live my life, to move forward, and to remember that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in the shadows, far from the eyes of the world.